Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S MindLab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if playing Tetris could actually help you forget bad memories? Well, this new study dives deep into that idea. So, there is this theory called the dual representation account, or DRA for short. It basically suggests that when something really bad happens, our brain stores the intense feelings and sensory bits of that experience separately from the context or the story of what happened. This is why, according to the theory, we might get these vivid, unwanted memories popping into our heads, like a snapshot, without remembering all the details of when and where it happened. Think of it like having a really strong picture but no caption. Previous research has suggested that doing something like playing Tetris, which uses a lot of visual and spatial thinking, right after seeing a disturbing film could help reduce these unwanted memories, these intrusive memories. And what is really interesting is that this intervention seemed to only affect the unwanted memories, the involuntary ones, without messing up our ability to voluntarily recall the film later. This was seen as super strong evidence for the DRA, supporting this idea of two separate memory systems. But science is all about testing and retesting, right? So a team of researchers decided to really dig into this. They ran 2 experiments designed very carefully to see if they could replicate these findings and specifically test the predictions of the DRA. They wanted to see if this Tetris trick really worked. In their first big experiment, they had a few key questions. First, could they get the same result as before? That Tetris reduced unwanted memories, but not the ones we tried to recall. They also wanted to make sure they were comparing apples to apples, making the tests for both types of memory as similar as possible. They also wondered if the effect of Tetris would be stronger if people watched a disturbing trauma film compared to a neutral film. The idea here was that the DRA predicts this special dissociation happens more with intensely emotional experiences. And another big question was whether watching the trauma film would actually make it harder to remember things voluntarily compared to the neutral film. Again, if the DRA holds true. Lastly, a key idea from the DRA is that these 2 types of memory, the involuntary intrusions and the voluntary recall, are pretty independent. So they wanted to see if someone who had lots of unwanted memories would also have great voluntary recall, or if there was no link between how much unwanted stuff people remembered and how well they could recall things on purpose. But here is where things get really interesting. The results were not what they expected at all. The Tetris game, the Visuospatial Intervention, it didn't seem to reduce the unwanted memories, and to top it off, the voluntary and involuntary memories were actually positively correlated. This means people who remembered more unwanted things also tended to remember more things voluntarily. This is the opposite of what the DRA predicted. Because these findings were so surprising, they ran a second experiment. This time, they focused just on trying to replicate the effect of Tetris on involuntary memories from the trauma film. They refined their methods, trying to make it even more similar to previous studies that did find an effect. But again, they came up empty. Their analysis showed strong evidence that the Tetris intervention simply didn't have the effect they expected on these unwanted memories. So, what does this all mean? The researchers are pretty clear. Their findings seriously challenge the dual representation account, at least when it comes to explaining intrusive memories in these lab-tested scenarios with artificial trauma. Essentially, this study suggests that a popular explanation for why traumatic memories pop up unexpectedly might not be as solid as we thought. At least in controlled lab settings, it's a call to rethink how unwanted memories work. Let's quickly recap what they did in the experiment. They showed people either a disturbing film or a neutral film. Then, some people played Tetris for a bit, while others did a different, less visually demanding task, like listening to a podcast or just resting. After that, they tested people's memory in different ways. They used something called the Vigilance Retrieval Task, or VRT, which is kind of like a steady attention task where you have to do something else, but then you are asked to report any memories that pop up spontaneously. They also collected diary entries over a few days to track any unwanted memories that happened in everyday life. The first big prediction, hypothesis A, was that Tetris would reduce unwanted memories more than voluntary memories, especially for the scary film. Hypothesis B was that Tetris would be even more effective at reducing unwanted memories for the trauma film than for the neutral film. Hypothesis C predicted that watching the trauma film would make it harder to voluntarily remember things compared to watching the neutral film. And hypothesis D was that the number of unwanted memories a person had wouldn't be related to how well they could recall things voluntarily. When they looked at the results, the big story was that the Tetris intervention didn't really do much. For hypothesis A, which was about Tetris reducing involuntary memory but not voluntary, they found no real evidence for this. For hypothesis B, which predicted Tetris would work better for the trauma film, they also found no significant effect. In fact, for one of their measures of memory, they found more involuntary memories in the neutral condition after Tetris. That is wild! Hypothesis C about the trauma film impairing voluntary recall also wasn't supported. There was no evidence that people remembered less of the trauma film voluntarily compared to the neutral film. And the crucial one, hypothesis D, that involuntary and voluntary memories would be unrelated. They found strong positive correlations. The more unwanted memories people had, the more voluntary memories they also recalled. This is a direct punch to the gut for the DRA's core idea of two separate systems. So, they tried again in experiment 2, focusing just on the trauma film and Tetris intervention to see if they could get that hoped-for effect on involuntary memories. They even improved their methods, making the control condition more basic and increasing experimenter blinding. But guess what? Still no effect. Even with a more streamlined setup and aiming to replicate previous success, Tetris just didn't reduce the unwanted memories of the trauma film. So, at the end of the day, these two experiments with over 400 participants found no support for the key predictions of the dual representation account. They couldn't replicate the selective interference effect. They didn't see voluntary memory get worse for the trauma film. And they found that involuntary and voluntary memories were actually linked, not independent. It is important to note the researchers are careful to say this doesn't necessarily mean the DRA is wrong for explaining full-blown PTSD, which is a much more complex condition. But for explaining intrusive memories in a lab setting with a mild trauma analog, it seems to fall short. What the study does suggest is that maybe we need to rethink the idea of these two separate memory systems for trauma. Instead, the findings lean towards what they call unitary memory models, where voluntary and involuntary recall come from the same underlying memory trace. So, what is the takeaway here? The simple idea that playing Tetris immediately after a disturbing experience can prevent unwanted memories might not be a reliable phenomenon in a lab setting. And more broadly, the theory that our brains split traumatic memories into sensory bits and context might need some serious revising based on this research. Now, every study has its limits. These participants were healthy adults without a history of trauma, so we can't automatically say these findings apply to people with PTSD. Also, they were tested in a lab, which is different from real life. What does this mean for you? Well, it suggests that the exciting findings about Tetris preventing bad memories might be more fragile than we thought, and maybe not a universal fix. It encourages us to look for other ways to understand and perhaps manage unwanted memories. Future research might explore why these Tetris effects seem to disappear or only appear in specific contexts, like maybe only in diary reports over longer periods, or when memory reporting isn't as detailed. Or perhaps focus on how our intentions and goals shape memory retrieval. What do you think about these findings? Does it change how you think about memory? Let us know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more insights from the world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.